Hello everyone, welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're going to be painting the Trench Crusade Prussian Stosstruppen Warband. I really do hope I said that correctly. This is the first in what I hope will be many Trench Crusade painting tutorials. The model ranges that are being released look absolutely fantastic. I think they fit our Grim Glow style that we do. Great theme, great aesthetic. Yeah, was really looking forward to painting these guys. They've been in the grey pile of awesomeness for a while, and I just got the urge to paint them. So this is a long tutorial, but we're covering off everything that we need to do, focusing on a few models, but picking out the details that are needed for each of the models to make them stand out. So each of these models is getting almost the character treatment that we would usually do to make them stand out on the tabletop. So first off, we're going to cover the Griblies, the sort of main units, the Stosstruppen, the Yeoman, and then finally the last stages will be for the Hauptmann and the Feldkaplan. So first off, for the green, I'm using the Vallejo German uniform green because I decided on this one because it's a nice sort of traditional German uniform colour. It fits the colour on the sort of box art. I wanted the green to be relatively bright but not too bright, and I also wanted it to be used primarily then as for the highlight colour as well. So when you shade this down, it also works well if you add some other colours to it to desaturate it and give a highlight colour, which is what we're going to do, so that you maintain this green uniform colour throughout your highlighting and final spot highlights. So wherever this colour is used on your miniatures, so some have it across all of their uniform and some have it just on their sort of trousers, but just base coat. Now this is quite a thick paint, so it does need watering down. I have to over thin paints at the moment, primarily because it's about 30 degrees in the UK. It's very, very hot. So yeah, just take your time. The guy that I'm showing there with the cape was my test model, but as you can see, the cape was also painted in the German uniform. So yeah, just take your time now, base coat all of the areas. You'll probably only need one coat of this, but if you do thin it down heavily, then you might need two coats, but I was able just to cover it all in one. I primed the model in the Army Painter's matte black air primer through the airbrush. So we're a bit, from my other tutorials, I generally work on one area, get it to the standard I want it, then move on to the next. But with these guys, because I'm going to be using some washes, I was sort of doing the more traditional base coating and then move on to the washes. Now, for the sort of dusty beige coloured overcoats and jackets and whatever, I'm using AK Mud Brown. Now, in hindsight, on the test model, I actually didn't do this. I base coated them in AK Light Earth and then applied the washes over the top of that. So if you want to have quite a dark looking beigey shirt, then start with mud brown, follow this tutorial. If you wanted to have a slightly lighter one and potentially miss some steps, then you could base coat in the light earth instead to have a lighter finish. I think what I would probably do if I was painting these again would be to base coat them in mud brown, because it's just a nice neutral colour to go over the black, but then go over the top of that in AK Light Earth and then work from there. But that's why we paint models. That's how we learn, that's how we progress our skills, is by painting them and seeing how it happens. So yeah, but primarily, either if you're going for a very, very light finish or the sort of finish to match with this, is just do a base coat of the AK Mud Brown. So next up we're going to base coat all of the leather, and for that I use AK Afro Shadow, which would be a sort of Warhammer Rhinox hide if you were using a Warhammer paint. So very simple now, just go around picking out all the leather. There's quite a lot I found on these models. There's all the straps around the gun, the guy with the little musician guy who I absolutely love, the straps holding his little harpy thing, his xylophone I think, onto it, holding the swords. Yeah, it's just base coated in this Afro Shadow. Now for the Feldkaplan, he is wearing what on the box art is a sort of leather robe, but I'm not painting that as leather. I'm using, as you saw in the beginning, I'm using purplish magenta colours for that. But if you were going to paint it as leather, then just follow these steps on that guy as well. So next up, once you've done all of that, it's wash time. Now to keep in mind here, I'm not washing really the leather that we've just done. I'm trying to keep the wash away from that. Now the wash I'm going to be using is Nuln Oil from Warhammer. You could use Agrax Earthshade, brown wash, black wash, whatever dark wash you've got. I've just got pots and pots of Nuln Oil, so I'm using that. Now my Nuln Oil, I do a thing where I pour out into a separate tub, little pot, about a third, and then fill the rest back up with a water mix, with just water, so that my Nuln Oil is slightly thinned down, because I find sometimes it can give too much, it can darken it too much. So if you want to do that, that's fine. If not, you can just pour a little bit out and just thin it down separately. But whatever wash you use, just treat it how you normally use it. If you know it's going to be very, very dark, just thin it down a little bit, because I didn't want to go too dark on this. But the idea here is just wash over your beige colour and your green colour. Again, don't let it pool too much in places. This is just so that we can define the shapes now, and then making our layering and highlighting a lot easier. You could, if you wanted to, use a green wash on the German uniform colour there, but I didn't want to move away from that German uniform colour. It gives that nice Austro-Hungarian German type green that we're so used to seeing. I know Trench Crusade is sort of, in essence, a World War I type theme, but we all know that when we see that type of German green, we instantly think of the war, and that's the sort of look that I was going for. So I've dimmed my light down a little bit, only because I found I was getting a lot of bounce back lighting happening during some of these phases. So this next step is we're just going to be relayering now. So I've thinned down that German uniform colour, and I'm just relayering. So what that means is I'm just painting back the green, ignoring the recesses, and just painting in those larger, flatter areas and the creases, just to bring them back up to that standard base colour that we had. then I also do the same with the mud brown, so just bring that back up to the standard layer. If you just went straight onto light earth, then you would do that, you would bring it back up to that light earth standard that we had initially. So the next stage, once you've just done this layering up, we'll be moving on to our highlight, and that will be with on the green we'll be doing the highlight. For that we're going to use ice yellow, which is a nice desaturated colour. It's not white, it looks pretty white on the palette there, but it is not white, it's just very, very bright. And I create, I suppose, about a 50-50 mix of the of the German uniform and the ice yellow. I add a little bit of water into it just to thin it down, just so it flows off the brush easier. Like I said, it's really hot, so even on the wet palette I had to heavily water these down. Now all I'm really doing here is I'm just finding all the creases and raised areas and doing almost edge highlights, just picking those out. I'm not doing traditionally straight lines and nice edges. I'm sort of doing downward scratchy motions with the brush just to give some of that material some texture. Don't worry if it goes really, really bright, the paint will dry back slightly darker. When it's wet it feels really bright. If it is dark, you can just heavily thin down some German uniform and just glaze it over the top just to tone it down a little bit. This highlight here also represents not only the highlight that we've got on the uniform, but that where it's desaturated in colour, it shows that it's worn as well. So it works in two ways. Some highlights are like what you could have done is just go for a bright green, but with these desaturated highlights, it just gives the model's extra character. It looks like the stuff is worn through. So now I've moved on to the beige using the AK Light Earth, and all I'm doing here is I've thinned it down, and now I do what we've done with the green uniform. I follow the same principles with the beige now, where I'm just doing edge highlights on some of those areas just to bring the colour back in. Now on the helmets I wanted to get a sort of heavily washed look, so I do thin the paint down a little bit into a sort of glaze, sort of a heavy glaze, and I glaze the helmets from that little recess, the little divot recess, upwards towards the spike that's on the top, so that you get a kind of gradient from that recessed area and up. We'll be knocking it back a little bit again later on with some further glazes just to add some depth and damage to it. But here, yeah, we're just bringing back in that nice AK Light Earth so that we get nice colour transitions from that mud brown up into the light earth. Now, if you went for a really, really bright look and you've got a base coat of light earth already, you would use AK Deck Tan to push up the brightness. Or if you're using Warhammer, you would use like Screaming Skull, I think is their brightest pale colour. If you find that you've gone a bit too bright on the sort of helmet side, you could just use a dark colour just to knock it back, so just some washed out, some watered down Nuln Oil. I love using Tenebrous Grey for a lot of washes and glazing. Now Tenebrous Grey is a it's almost black, but it's got a hint of purple to it, and when it dries kind of dusty, and I use it quite a lot in my painting, especially with glazing into shadows. So what I've done is I've created a wash mix of this on the wet palette. It's 1 part paint, one little like brush bit of paint, to about 6-7 drops of water. You need to really thin it down because it is a very pigment, colour rich colour. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the Tenebrous Grey and I'm pushing it down into the shadows and recesses to create some more depth. So as you can see here, remember with glazing, where you leave your brush, in fact with all the painting that we do, where you leave your brush is where most paint will be left. So if you're glazing downwards into a recess, more paint will be left where the brush removes itself from the recessed area. So just keep that in mind when you're painting and doing glazing. That helps then get the definition. So what I'm doing here is with the idea of these small models, we need massive contrast between dark and lights, which helps everything stand out. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating that contrast between our lovely highlights and our dark shadows. So the glazing of highlights and shadows is done throughout miniature painting. As you're painting these models, you're looking at it, assessing it, and putting a bit more emphasis on certain areas. If obviously you want to just do tabletop standard, then you don't necessarily have to do this. You can just do base coat, wash, highlight, and then move on. But I find with warbands, each of these models is its own little separate character, and so we like to put the attention onto each model just so that they all stand out on the tabletop. So we've done quite a lot of work here on the models already, and they're already looking pretty cool with our greens and beiges, looking very war themed already. And as I mentioned earlier, we're just taking our time, especially on the helmets, just adding in some edge highlights and some little lines and dots and stabby motions with the brush, just to give some texture to those helmets, just to make them look like they're battle damaged and worn through. I don't like to have nice clean soldiers on the battlefield. I imagine they've been beaten quite heavily. If at any point you do happen to go over other areas that have not been painted yet, you can just bring those back with your original black primer. You don't necessarily have to go black primer, you can use a dark grey or a grey. I just find it helps sometimes when you use these colours, that if you use a dark colour, it sometimes saves you having to do a wash, because you can use the dark colour with some careful paint strokes to sort of make it look like it's in shadow, so you leave a little space around rivets and dents and stuff, so you don't have to go back over it with a wash. And as you can see with the tutorial that I'm providing here, I'm showing you how I've done this across pretty much all of the models. So I'm taking the time to show you how I've done this across the range. But the steps are pretty much the same across these initial Gribblies. There's only the guy with the xylophone, the burner, and then obviously the Hauptmann and the Feldkaplan that have the different bits on them that make them stand out. So now that we've done the sort of main part of the uniform, we're moving on to the leather. So the next colour we're going to be using after the base coat with Afro Shadow is AK Deep Brown. Now, it's pretty straightforward. This is a standard layering now, and we're covering probably 90% of the Afro Shadow in this deep brown. Now, the 10% we're not covering is the bits that are in the recesses, in the very shadowy areas. So I'm just taking my time here. I've got either a size 0 or a size 1 brush from the Raphael range, the 8404s. Just because the brush is big doesn't mean it's going to be hard to handle. Sometimes the bigger brushes have very fine tips to them and are brilliant for doing fine intricate work. You don't need a really small brush to do fine intricate work. It's more about the tip size, and I find that the Raphael 8404s always have great tips and they're maintained over a lot of painting. So yeah, with the deep brown, I'm making sure I do an edge highlight, but then trying to leave some of that Afro shadow in the deepest recesses so that you don't have to then hit it with another wash. If you do, then just give it a very light wash of that Tenebris Grey that we've used, or some watered down other wash. We don't want to darken this deep brown down too much. Just need to be very careful. Once you've painted all of the leather in that deep brown, our highlight colour is with AK Cork, which is a nice pale brownish fleshy type colour. Now the goal here is to do an edge highlight and just to add some scratches and scrapes, and some just highlight points of where the leather is most worn. So a nice edge highlight, and then I'll just highlight areas where I want the leather to be most worn, sort of around where it meets with bits of leather, or where it's overlapping with leather, or where it'd be most rubbed. It doesn't have to be ultra realistic. The idea is just to add some weathering and damage to this leather, and to highlight all the edges so that it stands out from other parts that are around it. So there were some places where I caught some of the shadows, and I needed to just bring them back. So again, I just make a wash of Tenebrous Grey, and I gently just glaze that down back into the shadow areas so that I create that definition really around where the leather is joined a belt buckle, or two bits of leather are joined together. Just add a little bit of this in just to get that definition. It really does make areas stand out when you have deep shadows and bright highlights. So what I've got on the palette there is just some AK Grim Brown. So for the boots, I wanted just a different looking leather. I mean, you could just paint them in the leather we've just done, but I didn't want them too bright. So I'm just painting them with AK Grim Brown, and then I'll do a subtle highlight, almost a dry brush type highlight with AK Leather Brown. I'm going to be hitting them with a lot of washes later to get the to blend them in with the basing. So it doesn't have to be too precise. I just wanted some definition. So yeah, that's Grim Brown from AK, then with a dry brush highlight of Leather Brown. If you were to do them in your normal leather colours that we've just originally done, I would do the Afro Shadow, the deep brown, and then probably leave it at that. I wouldn't do a highlight with the cork. for the wood on the guns and the grenades, I skipped a step there, a bit annoying, but I used AK chocolate, which is a nice rich brown, kind of a sort of mahogany type brown, and I just base coated all of the wood in those colours. Now I then added a little bit of ice yellow, so I wanted a highlight on the wood, but I didn't really like it. It started to look like beige of how we've done the armour, not the armour, the beige overcoats. So actually I go back over it in the chocolate brown colour and just do a subtler highlight with a bit of with the cork mixed in with the AK chocolate. But really for the guns and the sticks of the grenades, just any wood type colours work here, just to try and make them, try not to use the same browns that you've used across the other parts, because it will just blend in a bit too much. But yeah, any dark browns, dark reddish browns for the wood. I mean, you could use black and just do some subtle grey highlights. But when you look at a lot of reference photos, the wooden guns are a sort of rich wood colour. You could even do some little striation lines on there, like the age lines of the wood. But just make sure you leave, obviously, some of the areas matte black where we're going to be doing the metallics a bit later on. So once I've done a majority of these models, pretty much everything apart from the metallics and the faces, I sprayed them all with some AK Ultra Matte varnish. I did that, one, because I want to protect these models. I found that the paint does flake off the plastic a little bit, if knocked, a little bit easier than some other ranges, but it also unifies everything. And I found that there was a little bit of glossiness with some of the paints that we've been using, especially the green. So I wanted to get rid of that. And so any matte primer, matte varnish just over the top. But I find the AK Ultra Matte straight through the airbrush is just a gem. Now you can brush it on, but just through the airbrush it takes moments. So to paint the faces, I just very basic method here. I use Kislev flesh from Warhammer, a couple of thin layers over that. I then do a wash of AK wine red. You could use Warhammer Vulpes Pink or Carroburg Crimson, but whatever of those three colours you use, which is sort of red, they're sort of reddish purple, heavily water them down. 1 part water to 5, 6, 7, maybe more parts. 1 part paint to 5, 6, 7 parts water. So they're heavily thinned down. It doesn't matter if they're over thinned, you can just add more layers. If it's under thinned, you'll just create a bright pink face. So I apply that as a wash over the top. You could just use any other flesh wash, but I find this this wine red gives the face a little bit more character, a little bit more realism. I don't generally like to use that word when we're doing these miniature paintings, but yeah, just a little bit more realism to those faces. You could then do a subtle wash over the top with some Reikland flesh shade, but I find this pinkish wash does the trick. I then fill in the mouth with a little bit of black, pick out the tongue with a bit of red, and any sort of moustaches or anything like that, just pick out with any sort of colour you want to use for that, like greys or browns. The rims of the glasses I pick out later with a bit of half the silver that we use. I do like to add a bit more definition around the eyes and the cheeks and the mouth, just to make those stand out. So next up is all the metallics, and I start off with AK gunmetal, which is a nice dark metallic colour, and I'm just going to paint in all of the metals. So that's most of the guns, the belt buckles, the strap buckles, a couple of the masks are silver, the spikes on the head, the grenades, little rivets, little buttons that are around the model as well. Try and pick those out. It's really handy when you try and pick that stuff out. It just adds some definition and some just difference to the models. And when you pick out the designs and the stuff that they've sculpted, it really does help. So just take your time. And as I said, I use AK gunmetal. I find it's a nice dark, rich silver, hint of blue to it. Great when you dry brush it on. It looks really dirty. For the guy with a little flamer torch, I just paint all of that in this gunmetal colour. If you do use a bright silver, then just knock it back with some brown wash or black wash. To finish off the faces, once the sort of flesh wash has dried, you saw there I was, when you know waiting for items to dry, you can just move on to the next part. I then just water down some of that initial Kislev flesh and just do a sort of layering over the raised areas with that. And then for the final flesh highlight, I use some flayed one flesh from Warhammer, and I just do that over the sort of the cheeks, the tops of the ears, around the mouth, the nose, the eyebrows, and then thin it down and just glaze it on top of the bald guy's head, just so it looks a little bit brighter. then just following on, I now go back to finish off all the metallics that I'd started. For any gold, I use AK Rusty Gold, which is a nice deep, rich, dark gold colour. So I pick out the shoulder pads, the iconography on their chest plates. It's not too much on the normal Gribblies, obviously with the musician, his little xylophone or whatever is painted gold as well. For some of the metallics, especially on this the flamer guy, I water down some tenebrous grey again and just create a wash of that tenebrous grey. I initially paint it pretty much all over that the flamer unit. I add some weathering to that flamer unit later just to show you how to do that if you wanted to keep it silver. And then I add 2 or 3 more layers of that wash, that tenebrous grey wash, over the top of the flamer part, just so that it darkens it down and gives it a sort of sooty type finish. So yeah, we're starting to finish these main guys off now. One of the final bits we're doing is adding in the red trim. So I base coat the red trim in AK black red, and then I do little highlights with AK deep red. Now, which are kind of like Mephiston red and Evil Sun scarlet, just with any dark red and then a bright red. If you didn't want to have to do this twice, then you could just go over it with just your like Evil Sun scarlet or Mephiston red. But I wanted just to keep some shadows in some of those recessed areas, or the areas that aren't directly in the bright with this red colour. It's a bit around the base of the jackets, the collars. There are some around the cuffs as well. Just take your time. Just a brush with a good tip is what you need here. Don't overly thin the paint down, otherwise it will run off the brush too much. You don't need to put too much paint on the brush either. I've got my hand braced against my work mat and my painting hand. You can see I'm holding the brush very, very close there, near to the ferrule, and then pressing hard against my other hand just to keep my hand from shaking and model straight. To highlight the gold, I use AK Old Gold, which is like Warhammer Retributor armour if you're using the Warhammer range. And then just go around, edge highlight your gold, and just add little bits where there's some flatter areas sort of on the panels. You can just pick those out a bit more, but not too much highlight. I didn't want to highlight the metallics too much. I wanted to keep that worn battle look that we've got. But you know, once we've added like those tenebrous grey washes to areas, it gives it a really nice dirty, dusty look. So just a few highlights here and there is all that's needed. So using the deep red, we're just going to add some little glowing effects to these guys now. So I just paint some deep red into the little vent holes on the burner. I then paint it onto the musician's spectacles, and there's a couple of guys that have got sort of metal face plates. I paint it into the eye sockets and the vent holes that are there. Now the idea with these glowing effects, even though they're very small, is that this initial red, deep red, is the coldest colour, and then we use fluorescence to glow to get our hottest colour where the light is most intense. So I add some of this deep red. I then use Green Stuff World fluorescent red and paint over it all with the fluorescent red, and then I use AK fluorescent orange and just do little dots with the fluorescent orange just to show that's the brightest point. We've just got very subtle looking red glowing effects. In my other videos I do them on larger areas just to get some depth going. Yeah, but the idea of the glowing effects is that the darker the colour, the cooler the colour, the brighter, the cooler the temperature, the brighter the colour, the hotter. So the deep red is acting as our cold colour, and then the fluorescence will be acting as our warm colours. But where the details are so small on this, we're sort of limited to the colours that we can use. But the red to the fluorescent red to fluorescent orange will just work quite well. And that pretty much covers the Gribblies, your sort of main bulk of the Warband. The tutorial now shift and focus onto the Hauptmann and the Feldkaplan. Now a lot of what we've done across the other models will work on these two other ones we're working on. So any leather that you want to paint, you would just paint in the same way. Any of the sort of guns you'd paint in the same colour. The metallics are done in the same way. If you just wanted to paint them as per these others, you would just use the same methods and just use some of the different bits I'm going to show you to just pick out some of the details. But I'm going to use a couple of different colours and methods on these other two figures, just so I wanted them to stand out a bit more on the battlefield. So the Hauptmann, we're going to be doing some glowing effects and some object source lighting and some bounce effects of light, just to make it a bit different. And on the Feldkaplan, we're going to be doing some purples, magentas, some washed out yellows, some of the parchments and the feathers as well on his backpack, just to make all of that stand out. And again, for the last part of this tutorial, that's what we'll be focusing on. So for the purple robes, which is on, I paint them on the jacket, on the woman, the sort of knight looking woman, and obviously the Feldkaplan. To get nice rich purples that I wanted for this, but I also wanted to get a nice washed out look as well. I base coat in AK Dragon Blood, which is a really rich purple magenta. It's just a great colour. You only need one coat of this, it covers the black really, really well. Then made about a 50-50 mix of the AK Violet mixed in with the AK Dragon Blood, a little bit of water just to thin it down. And the idea here is now I'm picking out all of the raised areas, just leaving the Dragon Blood in the deepest recesses. So a little bit like we did with the green when we're layering up. I'm just doing that with this 50-50 mix, so that we leave the Dragon Blood in the deepest recesses and pick out all of the raised highlights with this mid-tone. The overall look we're going for, I actually don't use the colour on the furthest right there, the AK Magenta. I just mix in some of the vampiric flesh that's in the top there to create the desaturated highlights that give it that worn. So we're still highlighting, but it just gives it a worn out look. On the highlighting with that 50-50 mix, I then just use some pure AK Violet and painting again on a smaller area within the highlight that we've just done, just so that we get another layer of highlighting. To start getting the desaturated highlight, I mix in a little drop of the vampiric flesh, and now I just do a scratchy edge highlight to give some texture to the highlight around the hood, the most raised areas of the robes, especially, and an edge highlight as well on the bottom of the robes. almost a final highlight, I add a little bit more of the vampiric flesh in and do an even smaller edge highlight. Once that was done, I wanted to give the feathers a sort of purplish type hue to them. So actually what I did was I then I base coated the rest of the model, everything that was left, with tenebrous grey from AK. Then I mix in a little bit of the grey blue from AK to create probably a 70-30 mix between the tenebrous grey and the AK grey blue. This is our first highlight. Now, I show you here, you can either do this by brush or by dry brush. If you do it by brush, you get a sort of brighter highlight straight away, whereas with dry brush, you have to go over it a couple of times. But the idea here is just to start picking out all of the edges and flat areas of the feathers with this mid-tone that we've created. dry brushed it or painted it on, we now create a lighter colour. So it's more part grey blue than it is tenebrous grey. So we create sort of a bright highlight. Now it does look grey there, but it is got a purple hint to it. Very subtle, but it's there. When you'll see the colour in sort of in your own eyes, you'll see there's a purple hint to this. So now again, it's a very small edge highlight, and I also just start to add a little bit of texture to these feathers by adding in just some diagonal lines to make it look like the individual feathers within a feather. And I'm not quite sure what they're called, like the hairs of a feather, I suppose. I think you know what I mean. Just adding in some lines just to give those some texture. You could, if you wanted to, just dry brush on with this next bright highlight, as we did with that initial highlight. Don't forget, obviously this part will take a bit of time because there's the fronts and the backs of each side. And once I've done with that, I then just water down a little bit of the pure grey blue and just do a very subtle highlight on the places that I wanted to be just catching the light a bit more than the others. The next stage, once we've done all these feathers, is the yellow tabard. Now, I didn't want a bright yellow, I wanted a washed out yellow. Now, there are a lot of colours in this. As everyone knows, painting yellow can be a bit of a chore. I found some easy ways using the airbrush, but yeah, painting yellow isn't necessarily just paint yellow. So I'm building up my yellow and then I knock it all back. So to build up my yellow, I do multiple layers of first with AK Sahara yellow. I then do highlights with AK sand yellow, and then finer highlights with AK ice yellow, to then get it to a point where you've got a nice breadth of colour between dark yellows and a bright yellow. I then glaze it with AK volcanic yellow, and that has a nice effect of just knocking it back. It still gives the impact that it is yellow, but it's really, really desaturated. If you didn't want it desaturated, you could do you could work it up, your Sahara yellow, and then use volcanic yellow with ice yellow. You could even paint it all with Wraithbone from Warhammer, and then hit it with the Iyanden yellow contrast paint. I wanted to go for an extremely desaturated yellow look, so I sort of build it up to yellow and then knock it back, and then hit it with a bit later on. I add a few little glaze washes of tenebrous grey into the recesses just to make some of those areas stand out. when we jump to the next section, you'll see for the silvers and golds on this guy, I did exactly the same methods. Just painted it in the gunmetal, painted it in the rusty gold, just to do all the silver and golds. There was nothing different done. The next part will be the parchments, of which there's a lot on this guy. So I base coat I'll show you basically how to paint one parchment, and then you can use it across all the others. So I base coat the parchments in AK Mud Brown. I then use AK Light Earth as the first layer to bring them up to a nice bright colour. Parchments are always good fun to paint. It's knowing whether to go too bright or too dark on them. I go sort of for a mid-tone look. There I've added in, I create sort of mixes here. So with the mud brown, I create a 50-50 mix with AK Light Earth. I then go up to pure Light Earth from AK. If you wanted to go even brighter, you could introduce some AK Deck Tan as a final edge highlight, just to make them really, really bright. I don't generally go to pure white, I always go for those off-white bone colours for the parchments. You could just use Light Earth and hit them with some maybe some Seraphim sepia, like a sepia wash, to knock them back and to add definition. But I'm showing how I painted one, and then I just basically painted all of the rest using this method. After doing all the parchments, which did take a little while, I'm just going to do some glowing effects on the couple of lanterns that are on his body, or just hanging from his robes. So I base coat them. I base coat all of the bottom part of the lantern, where the sort of candle's glowing through, in AK Black Red. Then they've sculpted, obviously there's little frames, so in the glass part of the lanterns, I then paint with the Blood Red. I then do little dots of white in the centre part of each of those bits of glass. Then I overpaint all of it in the Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red. And then with the AK Orange, Fluorescent Orange, where we painted that little white dot, I just paint that little white dot with the Fluorescent Orange, just to give our glowing effect. So we go from the dark red up to the Fluorescent Orange, getting smaller and smaller with those highlights as we go, to create very subtle but quite effective little glowing lanterns. It just adds a little bit of character, breaks up some of the stuff that's going on with the model, makes it stand out a little bit more on the battlefield as well. of an optional extra here. Once we've done the lantern highlights, is I thin down some AK Tenebris Grey and then do some little writing on all of the parchments. Bit of a fiddly job, took a little bit of time, but not too long. There's a lot of parchments. And all I do is just, with a thin down Tenebris Grey, a steady hand, with a nice fine tip, is just some squiggly lines again. It is optional, but it does add just a little bit more to each of the models. It's very subtle, but we know they're there. Now I then hit the model with a brush using the matte varnish again, but don't get it over the lanterns that we've just done and the metallics, because we want to maintain their sort of shine. So just some matte varnish over almost the material side of the model, but not over the metallics. And that will be this model finished. See, as I mentioned before, anything that we haven't painted on this is covered off in some of the other parts of this video. The final model that I painted was the Hauptmann, and obviously I built that as the female head with the sword at her back holding the gun. Equally, you could do these methods on the other version where he's holding the sword with this fancy hat. So what I've done is I've got a 3D bit from Epic Basing, which is a sort of a burning fire in a little cage, and I've painted all of that flame part using AK Intense White on. So I've got sort of sub-assembly this so it's easier. Now using the airbrush, I use AK Fluorescent Yellow and I paint the whole of the white in the AK Fluorescent Yellow. So to tone down the yellow, to make it look a little bit more burny, I use AK Fluorescent Orange, again through the airbrush. Oh, sorry, just punched the microphone there for no reason. So yeah, the fluorescent, this is slightly different now with the fluorescent orange. I'm hitting primarily the top part of the fire where it's cooler, because we're now cooling it down. I'm leaving some of the fluorescent yellow in that deepest part, and then with the airbrush, I'm almost just catching the top of where it's starting to get cooler, so that you get a gradient effect from the fluorescent yellow up into the pure fluorescent orange. Don't worry if you cover all of the fluorescent yellow, you can always hit it back with a little bit of white and then just paint on some fluorescent yellow afterwards, just to regain that glowing from the sort of bottom of the fire. So the idea here is the bottom of the fire is pure yellow, like fluorescent yellow, and the top of the fire, where it's all cool and smoky, will be the darker colours. get some heat and warmth onto this, we use my fantastic bottle of green stuff, well fluorescent red. The reason why it's got a bit of fragile tape around the bottom is I pierced it with a needle. You do have to shake these bottles heavily, they've got a little ball bearing in them, and I put an airbrush needle in there, an old one, to sort of break it all up, and it just pierced the bottom. That's why I've got a bit of tape on it. So what this fluorescent red does is it really cools it down, but it adds warmth to it, so it's a great colour. So of course the top of the fire will be cool, so that will be covered primarily in most of the fluorescent red. Then I just hit the bottom parts very subtly just to get the red across those parts. I then don't clean the airbrush out at this point. I just add some tenebrous grey into it with a little bit of water, and I paint the top part of the fire to create the smoke, and then just catch the edges just to darken down the frame that's holding the fire. We'll be dry brushing that a bit later, just to outline the frame. So after washing out the airbrush, I'm now going to be adding the object source lighting, like the bounce back lighting effects. So using AK Blood Red, or you could use Evil Sun Scarlet, it's equally as good. I then just spray it just slightly around the fire pit, just to give it like it's shining off the ground. I then imagine where the light from the fire will be bouncing back off of this model, and pointing the airbrush, I'm holding the model sort of with its feet pointing to my chest, and the airbrush is going upwards, so that I'm imagining the light is flowing up the model, so it's catching all those bottom edges where the light would be sort of naturally catching it, just picking out some of those. And just a few sprays is all it's needed here. We're not sketching it, these are pretty much the finished parts of where the highlights are going to be. You could do this with a brush using, I would use black red first and then do a little bit of layering it up with the blood red. But it's a very quick method just to get the effect that the light is bouncing off of those parts. Again, focusing, imagining you're the light source and where that would naturally hit the model, keeping the paint away from the areas behind where the light wouldn't catch. We're not going for ultra realism here. We're not doing bounce lighting where it's reflecting off the sword then reflecting back off the back of the armor. I'm not going for that on this tutorial. So once you've laid down your sort of sketch, I now, with paintbrush and the blood red, a little bit thinned down, I then emphasize some of those areas where I want it to be brighter. Now for me, the light will reflect more off of the armor than it will off of a sort of leather belt and any area that's close. So I'm just sort of edge highlighting and adding in subtle extra bits of that blood red on the areas where I want it to be really, really intense. Not too much. You still want some of that airbrush blood red in some of the other areas, just to maintain that sort of gradient that we've got. but certainly pick out the edges of any items that are metallic, because they would bounce the light back a bit more. And once we finish with that step, the next part I do is I do some slight edge highlights with AK Intense White. That will act as the basis of our frescent as we go over the top with the brush. So any area that's metallic, I pick out with a few lines and dots of AK Intense White. So the reason is that I like to do that, it just shows that those items are metallic and that they reflect the light a bit more. And sadly, the bit of camera work that was next was corrupt. But all I did was, with the fluorescent red, painted over all of, with the green stuff fluorescent red, painted over all of the red that we've just painted, including the white. And the fluorescent orange, I just painted that only over the areas we initially painted with the white, so that you get a nice effect of the fluorescent red up to the really shiny fluorescent orange. That's all that was done there. Nothing with an airbrush or anything like that. It was just paint the fluorescent red over all of the red you've just done, and then the fluorescent orange over just the white, and then that'll give you a nice glowing bounce back object source lighting effect. Now, really, for the rest of the model, a lot of this is using all of the techniques we've previously used. But with this model, you just need to take a little bit of care that we don't overlap our colouring here. So with the silver, make sure you just focus on the areas that are away from that lighting source that we've got, and try and leave a little bit of a gap between the glowing effects. Now for this model, it's quite handy. The way it's posed, you get natural definition from where our glowing would be to where the darker areas would be. So just take your time now, just keep in mind what we've already painted to keep that as red, and then we're sort of painting almost the back of the model. So yeah, I just wanted to keep that in just to show you how I was doing it, just for reference. The other part that stands out on this miniature is her hair. I wanted a nice redhead ginger for this lady. So I start with AK Deep Orange, and it's, I would think, 2 to 3 layers to cover the black primer that we've got on there. I then want to tone it down a little bit and just add some shade to where the plait is. You can see that I'm just fixing where I caught it with a little bit of the orange. Easy to fix. So I'm using some Reichland Flesh shade, just a little bit, and I paint this all over the hair, and yeah, all over the hair, just so that it goes into those recesses. Leave it a good few minutes to dry. I then use AK Pastel Peach, which is a nice desaturated bright orange, and I just do almost a sort of edge highlight here, just picking out the raised areas of the hair on the plait to make it stand out, and just adding a few lines on the top of her head where they've sculpted in some strands. And it's a nice, quite simple ginger hair method. You can use that on Space Wolves if you so wish. I then painted her jacket in the same purples as we did for the other character. You could also do it in the yellow, just using the same methods as before. So picked out the silvers and the gold, the brown of the gun, so everything was done in the same way, and then stuck her onto the base, and there we've got a really cool looking model on a fiery base. Here with a dry brush, I'm using some tenebrous grey, just hitting it onto the top of the smoke and just catching the frame as that would be dark and sooty. So this next part is, now with all the models done, we're going to do some weathering. So I'm using some AK Hull Red, and I decided I'd like to show you how you can make areas look really heavily worn and rusty. So the sort of gassy, liquidy flamer canister that's on his back, I paint pure, like completely in the AK Hull Red. Then our weathering is done with a couple of colours, and this is covered off in other tutorials I've got, but I just love using these colours for my weathering. So I use AK Dark Rust, AK Medium Rust, and AK Light Rust. And as I've said numerous times, they do exactly as they say they're going to do. Dark Rust is to give a dark rust, then you hit it with medium rust, then you hit it with light rust. They're really great colours. There are loads of other versions of rust from lots of different companies, but I just find those three are just really good, especially over the top of the Hull Red. If you want an area to look massively just rusty and filth, then always base coat it with that Hull Red. And all I do for my weathering is I create washes of the dark rust, medium rust, and light rust. I start with the dark rust over a sort of large area that you want to be rusty, then hit it with a medium rust on a smaller area, then hit it with the light rust over an even smaller area. And you create very quickly some nice weathery, dusty, dirty look. Great for grim sort of looking warbands. You can add as little or as much as you like. If you want, you don't go over the top with it too much and it looks a bit garish. Here I'm not using dark rust, I'm just using medium rust and light rust. And all I do with these, with a backpack, this bit, is just sort of stab it, wash it over the area, and then do the same method with the light rust. It just gives a nice effect, gives it some character, makes it look like it's been on the battlefield for a long time. You can hit it over the sort of helmet areas where the dust has been collected over the armour, add it over the boots, to the bits of trousers here and there, the bottom of the cloaks and the robes, to help blend it in. So one big thing, people sometimes struggle with is making the model look like it sits on the base. So that's where you use your washes to blend it. So any colours that you've used on your base, your earthy colours on your base, you make washes of those, and then you put a bit of them on the boots and the bottom of the robes, anything that's really near the ground, wash it onto those areas and onto the base itself, and you'll naturally make the model look like it's more in the base than on the base. I hope that sort of phrasing makes sense there. For these bases, I used the dirty down rust effect paint, so you just dollop it straight onto the model, and there's guides on their website, on the Dirty Down website, of how to use it. I just love using it. I think it's really grimy, really filthy. Makes the bases look just absolutely gross, befitting our little warband. And then I paint the rims in in Army Painter's matte black. So there we have it, your Stosstruppen warband for the Prussians. 8 models all painted up. This is actually, wow, I've got other long tutorials. I tend not to edit them too much so you can see everything that's going on. But yeah, nearly 3 hours, quite a long one. It was about a day's worth of painting in total for this warband. There's a lot of detail on them. They're really cool looking miniatures. I hope you've enjoyed following along, and if you've not used all of these colours, and I hope you've used something here is useful for you to help paint these and other miniatures in any range really. The purples, the silvers, the greens and the beiges, the lighting effects. You'll see in a lot of my other tutorials the glowing effects that we can create. So yeah, there they all are. As I said, I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTubey wonderness. And yeah, happy painting, my fellow painters.